January 17, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany, 800 hours. The winter air hung dense and frozen over the Messerschmitt assembly plant, where exhaust fumes from idling Bf-109 fighters mingled with the breath of ground crews. Major Hans Joachim Marseille's wingman, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, stood on the frozen tarmac, his leather gloves creaking as he gripped the intelligence briefing in his hands. The paper trembled, not from the cold but from what was written there. American bomber production figures, numbers so absurd they had to be propaganda. B-17 flying fortresses, one aircraft completed every 63 minutes. B-24 Liberators, one every 58 minutes. Stigler had shot down 17 Allied aircraft. He knew the weight of a bomber, the complexity of its systems, the thousands of rivets holding its aluminum skin together. These numbers were impossible. They had to be. Above him, the pale sun struggled through cloud cover that would burn away by noon, revealing skies that belonged to whoever could claim them. In 3 hours, he would climb into his cockpit and discover that the paper in his hands was not propaganda at all. It was prophecy. The factories of the Third Reich hummed with efficiency born of desperation, while across the Atlantic, a different kind of machine was awakening, one that would drown the Luftwaffe not in skill, but in sheer, unstoppable volume. For the German fighter pilots of 1943, the war had been an intoxicating demonstration of Teutonic superiority. The Blitzkrieg had validated everything they believed about German engineering, tactical brilliance, and warrior spirit. They had swept across Poland in weeks, brought France to its knees in 42 days, and sent the British scrambling back across the Channel at Dunkirk. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was the finest fighter aircraft in European skies, fast, maneuverable, deadly in the hands of pilots trained to individual excellence. Men like Adolf Galland, Werner Mulders, and Günther Röhl had become aces many times over, their kill counts climbing into double and triple digits. They fought with the confidence of craftsmen, each mission a demonstration of personal skill against inferior opponents. The Luftwaffe's elite squadrons operated under a philosophy that reflected broader Nazi ideology. Quality over quantity, the exceptional individual over the mediocre mass, Germanic perfectionism against democratic chaos. Their aircraft were hand-built by skilled workers who took pride in each machine. A Messerschmitt took approximately 4,000 man-hours to complete, assembled with precision in factories where tradition and craftsmanship still mattered. When a German pilot climbed into his cockpit, he flew a personal weapon, an extension of his will, maintained by crews who knew every rivet and strut. The Reich's propaganda emphasized this narrative constantly. German pilots were knights of the air, modern descendants of Richthofen's flying circus, warriors who embodied racial and cultural supremacy. Then America entered the war. At first, the Luftwaffe pilots laughed. America, that nation of hamburgers and Hollywood, jazz music and gangsters, a country that couldn't even provide its soldiers proper steel helmets in the last war. A mongrel democracy where assembly line workers and farmers' sons played at being warriors. The early encounters seemed to confirm German prejudices. American bomber crews flew in tight, predictable formations. Their fighter escorts had limited range. Their tactics were textbook, lacking the improvisational brilliance that marked Luftwaffe engagements. German aces shot them down by the dozens. Stigler himself had sent 3 B-17s spiraling to Earth in a single mission over Wilhelmshaven, watching their crews bail out as the bombers came apart in flames. Each victory validated the superiority they'd been taught to believe in, but something was wrong. Something the numbers began to whisper, then shout. The bombers kept coming. July 24, 1943, Hamburg, afternoon. Hauptmann Wilhelm Johnen had shot down 21 Allied aircraft. He was an expert in night fighting, a specialist in stalking British Lancasters through darkness, using the Liechtenstein radar mounted on his Bf-110. But today's mission was different. Today, he'd been scrambled at noon to intercept a daylight raid, an American raid. The sector controller's voice had been urgent. Large formation, bearing 270, altitude 7,000 meters. Very large formation. Johnen climbed through cloud cover and broke into sunlight. What he saw made his throat constrict. They stretched from horizon to horizon, a geometric constellation of four-engine bombers, their contrails weaving a white tapestry across the blue immensity of sky. He counted 30 in his immediate field of vision, organized into tight box formations. Behind them, more formations, and behind those, still more. He keyed his radio. "Commodore, I count over 100 bombers. Correction, over 200. Main got there everywhere." The controller's voice crackled back. "All fighters engage at will." Johnen rolled into his attack, diving toward the nearest formation. The bombers didn't break. They maintained their rigid discipline, each B-17 in precise position, their combined defensive fire creating an interlocking web of 50 caliber tracers. He fired a burst, saw strikes on a bomber's wing, then had to brake hard as tracers stitched toward his cockpit. He survived the pass. His wingman didn't, torn apart by concentrated fire from a dozen gun positions. They fought for 30 minutes. German fighters swarmed the formations like wolves attacking a herd of metal buffalo. They shot down bombers. Johnen personally saw 5 B-17s go down, trailing smoke and fire. But the formations never broke. The survivors pressed on to Hamburg, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. And when Johnen landed, fuel tanks nearly empty, to rearm and refuel, the ground 43, it should have been a triumph. "They'll need 2 months to replace those losses," Johnen said to his crew chief while mechanics swarmed his aircraft. The crew chief, an older man who'd served in the previous war, looked at him with something like pity. "Herr Hauptmann," he said quietly, "there's another formation coming. 300 bombers, they'll be here in 40 minutes. That was when understanding began to crystallize, cold and terrible. The Americans weren't fighting to win individual battles. They were waging a different kind of war entirely, one where arithmetic mattered more than valor, where industrial capacity trumped individual skill. For every bomber the Luftwaffe shot down, America was building 3 more. For every German fighter lost, the Reich could barely replace 1. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. The secret lay 5,000 miles away, in places with names that meant nothing to German pilots: Willow Run, Michigan; Fort Worth, Texas; Long Beach, California. There, in vast facilities that dwarfed anything in the Reich, America had industrialized warfare in ways that defied European comprehension. Willow Run was Henry Ford's masterpiece, a bomber factory that embodied everything National Socialism claimed to despise about American capitalism. It stretched for more than a mile under one roof, the largest single-story structure on Earth. Inside, the assembly line that had revolutionized automobile production had been adapted to aircraft manufacture with ruthless efficiency. A B-24 Liberator contained 125 million parts. At Willow Run, those parts flowed together in a carefully choreographed mechanical ballet that transformed raw aluminum into flying fortresses at a rate that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Every hour, workers bolted together wing sections, fuselage panels, tail assemblies, engine mounts. The aircraft moved down the line in stages, accumulating complexity as they progressed. Riveting crews followed precise sequences, each rivet placed according to blueprints that had been standardized across multiple factories. The propellers, enormous Hamilton standard units, were installed by specialized teams who could complete the task in 17 minutes. Engines came from Pratt & Whitney, already tested and certified, lifted into place by overhead cranes and secured by mechanics who'd performed the same operation hundreds of times. The electrical systems, hydraulics, oxygen equipment, gun turrets, each added in sequence, checked, and certified before the aircraft moved to the next station. At the end of the line, every 63 minutes, a new B-17 rolled out onto the taxiway. Painted olive drab and neutral gray, still smelling of fresh paint and machine oil, each bomber was flight-tested, armed, and ferried to modification centers where bomb sites and classified equipment were installed. Then they flew to embarkation points, to Florida, to Nebraska, to California, where crews took delivery and began the long flight to England, Newfoundland to Iceland to Scotland, island hopping across the Atlantic with bomb bays full of spare parts instead of ordnance. The Germans knew factories. They respected German efficiency, German engineering precision. But this was something beyond their conceptual framework. This was mass production elevated to an art form, democracy's chaotic energy channeled into industrial might that made the Ruhr Valley's output look artisanal by comparison. America wasn't building bombers. America was manufacturing air supremacy on an assembly line, turning out destruction with the same methods that produced Chevrolet and Coca-Cola. And the numbers were staggering beyond belief. December 14, 1943, Kiel, evening. Major Egon had developed the head-on attack, diving toward bomber formations from 12 o'clock high, presenting the smallest target profile while attacking the B-17's most vulnerable aspect. It was brilliant, deadly, and exhausting. He'd shot down 25 four-engine bombers personally, more than almost any other pilot in the Luftwaffe. But tonight, in the officers' mess, he sat with a glass of schnapps untouched before him, staring at a logistics report that someone had left on the table. The Americans commissioned 791 heavy bombers in November, he read aloud to the handful of pilots present. 791. In 1 month. No one spoke. They'd all seen the figures. They'd all done the arithmetic. We destroyed 114 bombers in November, Mayer continued, his voice flat, and lost 83 fighters. We had our best month of the war, and they still gained 677 bombers on us. 677. Oberleutnant Anton Hafner, who'd survived 42 missions, finally broke the silence. It doesn't matter how many we shoot down. They can replace their losses in days. It takes us months to train a replacement pilot, and we don't have the fuel to train them properly anyway. The boys coming in now have 40 hours of flight time. 40 hours. I had over 200 before my first combat mission. The mathematics were pitiless. A German fighter pilot in 1943 averaged 12 combat missions before being killed or seriously wounded. The Luftwaffe's pilot training program, already strained by fuel shortages, couldn't replace losses. Each veteran pilot lost represented irreplaceable experience. Meanwhile, American bomber crews cycled through English airbases in endless rotation. Fresh crews, fresh aircraft. The same basic mission repeated day after day with industrial persistence. But numbers alone didn't capture the psychological dimension of what the German pilots faced. They were warriors in a warrior culture, believers in the primacy of individual heroism. Every Nazi propaganda message, the exceptional German soldier could triumph over inferior masses through courage and skill. It was the Thermopylae myth, the Nibelungenlied ethos, quality transcending quantity through sheer force of will. The American bomber stream was democracy's answer to that mythology, and it was devastatingly effective precisely because it didn't rely on individual heroism. The B-17 crews weren't supermen. They were kids from Iowa and Brooklyn, Kansas and California, trained in 6 months and thrown into combat. Many were terrified. Their formations sometimes fell apart under determined attack. Individual bombers often missed their targets. But they kept coming, wave after wave, in numbers that made individual valor irrelevant. Mayer took a drink finally. "You know what the worst part is?" he said quietly. They're not even trying to outfight us. They're just overwhelming us like a flood, like the tide coming in. The symbolic object that haunted German pilots' dreams wasn't a weapon or a piece of technology. It was something far more prosaic: the bailout kit. When a Luftwaffe pilot shot down a B-17 and the crew successfully bailout out, German troops who captured them were required to inventory their emergency equipment. Standard Luftwaffe bailout kits contained basic supplies: a small amount of chocolate, water purification tablets, a compass, a knife, enough to survive for perhaps 2 days if you came down in hostile territory. American bailout kits were revelations. Each kit contained 2 pounds of concentrated rations, not mere survival chocolate, but a variety of high-calorie foods including malted milk tablets, hard candy, chewing gum, and bouillon cubes. There was a first aid kit with sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, and actual bandages, not the ersatz paper substitutes German troops had been using since 1942. A German officer who examined a captured kit at a POW collection point in France found a waterproof lighter, 50 feet of nylon parachute cord, a fishing kit, water purification tablets, a compass, maps printed on silk, and a booklet containing useful phrases in multiple languages. And cigarettes. 4 packs of American cigarettes. The officer, a logistics major named Heinrich Burl, would later write in his diary, "I examined the emergency kit of a shot-down American pilot today. It contained more wealth than a German Lancer sees in a month. Cigarettes that we haven't had in the Reich since 1941. Chocolate that our children dream about. Equipment of a quality we can no longer manufacture." This was meant to be discarded equipment, thrown away if not used. I realized then that we are not fighting an enemy. We are fighting a force of nature, an ocean of material wealth that makes our sacrifices meaningless. The bailout kit became a symbol, traded and whispered about among German troops. Each captured kit was carefully distributed, the cigarettes divided among officers, the chocolate given to wounded soldiers, the equipment studied and copied where possible. But copying was impossible. The nylon cord required petrochemicals Germany no longer had. The waterproof lighter used manufacturing techniques German factories couldn't spare time to implement. Even the chocolate required cocoa imports that the Allied blockade had choked off. What terrified thoughtful German officers wasn't the quality of individual items, it was the casual abundance they represented. This was asterisk emergency equipment, meant for survival situations that hopefully would never occur. Yet it was manufactured in such quantities that every bomber crew member received a kit. America was producing emergency equipment more sophisticated than Germany's frontline supplies, and doing it as an afterthought, a minor line item in a budget that also included building a bomber every hour. February 20th, 1944, Leipzig, dawn. Hauptmann Fritz Lassigkeit rolled his FW-190 into firing position behind a straggling B-17, its number 3 engine feathered and smoking. The bomber had fallen behind its formation, easy prey. He pressed the trigger, felt the cannon shudder, and watched strikes walk across the B-17's fuselage. The bomber staggered, pieces of aluminum skin tearing away. Then it dropped, spiraling down through cloud cover. His 30th kill. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. His radio crackled. Achtung! New formation bearing 090. Estimate 250 bombers with fighter escort. All fighters engage. 250 more. There were always more. Lassigkeit had been flying combat missions for 4 years. He'd fought over England, Russia, France, and now Germany itself. He'd watched the Luftwaffe evolve from a conquering force to a defensive one, seen comrades die by the hundreds, witnessed Germany's cities reduced to rubble by the endless bomber streams. And the bombers kept coming, more numerous now than in 1943, escorted by long-range fighters that the experts had said were impossible to build. The Americans had built them anyway. The P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the range of a bomber and the agility of a short-range interceptor. It shouldn't have been possible, but American engineers had done it by the simple expedient of trying, failing, iterating, and trying again with unlimited resources backing each attempt. Now those Mustangs ranged ahead of the bomber streams, hunting German fighters in their own skies. Luftwaffe checked his fuel gauge. Enough for one more engagement, maybe two if he was conservative. He looked down at his instrument panel, the altimeter showing 6,000 meters, the oil pressure steady, the gun camera loaded. Everything about his aircraft spoke of German engineering excellence. The Focke-Wulf 190 was arguably the finest fighter in the war, so it didn't matter. The mathematics had already determined the outcome. Germany was losing 400 fighters per month and could build 300 replacements. America was losing similar numbers but building 2,500 fighters per month. Every day the ratio worsened. Every mission the odds lengthened. Luftwaffe could shoot down 5 bombers today, and tomorrow there would be 600 more over Germany. He could survive this mission and the next 10, and it wouldn't change the fundamental equation. The Americans could replace their losses faster than Germany could inflict them. He advanced his throttle and climbed toward the new formation. Not because he believed it would change anything, but because it was all he knew how to do. The Ford Willow Run plant operated on 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. At peak production in 1944, it employed 42,000 workers, more people than lived in many German cities that still stood. The workforce was unlike anything seen in European factories. Women comprised 40% of the workers, operating hydraulic riveters, drilling precise holes in wing sections, assembling landing gear mechanisms. African Americans worked alongside whites in numbers that would have been unthinkable in the segregated American South. Though segregation still existed in many areas of American life, the factory floor demanded too much labor to maintain such inefficient barriers completely. The workers came from everywhere. Farm boys from Michigan, former automobile workers from Detroit, women whose husbands were fighting overseas, immigrants who'd fled Europe before the war. They represented the democratic chaos that Nazi ideology claimed made America weak. The mixing of races, classes, and backgrounds that supposedly precluded the unity necessary for total war. But on the assembly line, that chaos became a strange kind of strength. Because the workers weren't craftsmen building individual masterpieces, they didn't need years of training. They needed to perform specific, repetitive tasks with precision. A riveter needed to know how to operate a riveting gun and follow blueprints, a skill that could be taught in weeks. An engine installer needed to bolt engines to mounts and connect fuel lines according to specifications. No artistic interpretation required. The standardization that Nazi ideology despised as un-German and artistically dead became America's secret weapon. Each B-24 that rolled off the Willow Run line was virtually identical to the one before it and the one after. Parts were interchangeable across the entire production run. A replacement engine could be bolted onto any bomber without modification. A damaged wing could be replaced with one from a completely different aircraft. This standardization meant that repairs could be made quickly in field conditions, that maintenance crews didn't need specialized knowledge of individual aircraft, that logistics officers could stock spare parts knowing they'd fit any aircraft in the fleet. The Germans, with their emphasis on quality and craftsmanship, produced superior individual aircraft. A hand-built FW-190 might have tighter tolerances, smoother surfaces, finer finish work than a mass-produced Mustang. But when the FW-190 took battle damage, repairs required skilled mechanics and custom fabrication. When a Mustang was damaged, A crew could swap out the damaged component in hours and have the aircraft flying again. Quantity was becoming its own quality. At Willow Run, workers attached a plaque to the first B-24 completed in each shift, a small acknowledgement of the human beings turning raw materials into instruments of liberation. But the plaques were symbolic gestures in a process that had transcended individual craftsmanship. Each worker was a component in a vast machine, no more individually essential than a rivet or a bolt. The democratic irony was profound. The very dehumanization and industrialization that Marxists condemned in capitalist factories had been turned into a weapon against fascism. The assembly line, that ultimate symbol of capitalist alienation, was May 8, 1944, Berlin, midnight. Oberst Johann Steinhoff sat in the ruins of what had been the Luftwaffe's operations center, reading reports by the light of an oil lamp. The electricity was out again. The Americans had bombed the power station that morning. Around him, staff officers worked in pools of candlelight, pushing markers around maps in a tragic pantomime of strategic planning. The numbers were undeniable now. In April, the Luftwaffe had lost 489 pilots killed, missing, or permanently disabled. They'd graduated 396 replacement pilots from training schools. In the same month, American factories had delivered 2,608 fighters and 2,414 bombers. The mathematics allowed only one conclusion. Germany would lose the air war through attrition, even if German pilots maintained their superior kill ratios. But the kill ratios were falling too. The new American pilots weren't significantly better trained than the German replacements, but they didn't need to be. They flew in formations where experienced pilots could cover for novices. Their aircraft had reliability that allowed them to focus on fighting rather than nursing temperamental engines. Their bases in England were stocked with unlimited spare parts, fuel, ammunition. When a P-51 pilot expended his ammunition, he returned to base, rearmed in 20 minutes and flew another mission. When a German pilot expended his ammunition, he often found his base cratered by bombs, fuel in short supply, and replacement ammunition delayed by partisan attacks on rail lines. Steinhoff had recently returned from a meeting with Generaloberst Hans Jeskinek, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff. Jeskinek had looked like a man staring into an abyss. "Do you know what the Reichsmarschall said to me?" Jeskinek had asked. "He said we must maintain fighting spirit, as if spirit can stop bombs, as if willpower can conjure fuel from empty tanks." 3 months later, Jeskinek would commit suicide. His final words would be an acknowledgement that Germany had lost the air war, and with it, but on this night in May, Steinhoff was focused on a different revelation. An intelligence report had crossed his desk detailing American bomber production by facility. It listed factory names, production rates, and locations. Willow Run, 432 aircraft per month. Consolidated Fort Worth, 384 aircraft per month. Douglas Long Beach, 336 aircraft per month. The list continued for pages. Factories in Texas, California, Michigan, Georgia, Kansas. Each factory name was accompanied by production figures that would have represented Germany's entire monthly output. The report included photographs taken by German agents in America before the war, aerial reconnaissance showing the vast sprawl of American industrial facilities. Steinhoff stared at a photograph of Willow Run, trying to comprehend the scale. The building stretched beyond the photograph's frame. A note indicated it covered 3.5 million square feet. For comparison, Germany's largest aircraft factory, the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg, covered 400,000 square feet. "We're not fighting a country," Steinhoff said to his adjutant. "We're fighting a continent that has been turned into a machine for producing war materials, and we thought we could win." The transformation in German pilots' ideology was subtle at first, then catastrophic. It began with small doubts, questioning whether the propaganda about American industrial capacity might be understated rather than exaggerated. It progressed to grim acknowledgement that German tactics, however brilliant, couldn't overcome arithmetic. It ended in a kind of fatalistic desperation, where pilots flew missions knowing they couldn't alter the outcome, only delay it. The Nazi ideology that had sustained the Luftwaffe through the early war years was built on premises that American production exposed as fantasy. The Übermensch concept, the idea that superior German warriors would triumph over inferior but numerous enemies, collapsed when those inferior enemies arrived in such numbers that individual superiority became irrelevant. The belief in German engineering excellence meant little when excellent aircraft couldn't be produced in sufficient quantities. The heroism rang hollow when spirit couldn't deflect. 50 caliber bullets from bombers that stretched from horizon to horizon. Some pilots retreated into cynicism. They fought because fighting was what they knew, but they'd abandoned belief in victory. Others clung to increasingly desperate fantasies, wonder weapons that would reverse the tide, political collapse among the Allies, miracles that would vindicate their sacrifices. A few, the most honest, simply acknowledged what the numbers made clear. Germany had lost the war, and every mission flown now merely determined how many more pilots would die before the inevitable conclusion. Major Heinz Baer, who would survive the war with 220 aerial victories, later wrote, "After 1943, we weren't fighting to win. We were fighting to make the price of victory so high that the Allies might negotiate. But the Americans didn't negotiate. They simply built more bombers. Every day, more bombers. An endless stream of them, like a river that never runs dry. We were drowning men thrashing against a flood, and the flood was patient. It didn't need to outfight us. It only needed to keep rising until we went under." The psychological weight of that realization, that skill, courage, and sacrifice were insufficient, broke the ideological foundations of fascism more thoroughly than any propaganda could have. The master race theory required that superior Germans triumph through their inherent excellence. The reality was that superior Germans died in burning cockpits because the inferior democracy they'd been taught to despise could produce 10 aircraft for every one they destroyed. June 6, 1944, Normandy, dawn. Oberfeldwebel Joseph Priller and his wingman, Sergeant Heinz Waderczyk, were the only Luftwaffe pilots over the Normandy beaches on D-Day morning. Their entire squadron had been moved. The ships stretched from horizon to horizon. Thousands of them, landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, battleships. Above them, the sky was dark with aircraft. Not bombers this time, but fighters and transports, flying in formations so dense that collision seemed inevitable. Priller made one strafing pass along the beach, saw his cannon shells kick up sand among the landing troops, then fled inland with every Allied fighter in Normandy trying to kill him. Both pilots survived. When Priller landed and filed his report, he was asked for an estimate of Allied strength. "All of them," he replied. "Every ship they have, every aircraft, all of them." The Normandy invasion was the culmination of American industrial dominance. The landing fleet included 6,939 vessels. The air cover consisted of 11,590 aircraft, more aircraft than Germany possessed in its entire military, deployed in a single operation. The troops storming the beaches carried equipment that represented the output of hundreds of factories working in perfect logistical coordination, and those factories were still running. While the invasion proceeded, Willow Run was completing its 7,000th bomber. While American troops fought through hedgerows, factories in Michigan and Texas and California were building tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, sending an endless supply stream across the Atlantic to fuel the liberation of Europe. For German pilots watching from airfields in France, the invasion was the moment when abstract numbers became physical reality. The bomber streams they'd been fighting for 2 years had been only the visible edge of American industrial power. Now they could see the full scope of what they faced. An economic powerhouse that had converted its entire continental economy into a war machine without suffering significant privation at home. American troops landed on French beaches with 3 meals per day, cigarettes, chocolate, chewing gum, and more ammunition than they could carry. German troops defending those beaches were fighting on reduced rations, with ammunition rationed, and no air support because the Luftwaffe had been bled white over Germany's cities. The contrast wasn't merely material, it was ideological. Democracy's chaotic, undisciplined, commercial culture had proven more effective at total war. Everything the Nazis believed about the weakness of democratic societies had been revealed as projection. Germany was the nation that cracked under pressure, instituting increasingly brutal discipline to extract performance from exhausted populations. America was the nation that fought a global two-front war while maintaining civilian production of automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines. The totalitarian state that claimed total mobilization was outproduced by a democracy that never fully mobilized its economy. April 19, 1945, Bavaria, afternoon. Major Franz Stigler sat in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, waiting for fuel that would never come. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Soviet forces were in Berlin. American troops were 60 kilometers away. The sky above was empty of German aircraft, not because pilots were unwilling to fly, but because there was no fuel to fly with. Stigler thought back to January 1943, to the intelligence briefing that had seemed so absurd. 1 bomber every hour. He'd flown more than 400 combat missions since then. He'd shot down dozens of Allied aircraft. He'd watched the bomber streams grow from hundreds to thousands, watched American fighters range across Germany at will, watched his nation's cities reduced to rubble by the industrial power he dismissed as propaganda. He'd survived. Most of his comrades hadn't. The Luftwaffe's pilot casualty rate exceeded 80%. For every pilot sitting in a cockpit today, 4 were dead. And for what? The bombers had kept coming. The invasion had succeeded. The Reich was collapsing. All the skill, all the courage, all the sacrifice had accomplished nothing except to delay the inevitable conclusion that the numbers had predicted in 1943. An American P-51 flashed overhead, its pilot likely bored by the lack of opposition. Stigler didn't bother to scramble. Even if his aircraft had fuel, what would be the point? He couldn't shoot down enough American aircraft to matter. No German pilot could. The mathematics had always been against them. In his log book, kept hidden in his flight jacket, Stigler had recorded his thoughts throughout the war. The early entries were confident, full of belief in German superiority. The later entries were darker, questioning, exhausted. The final entry, written that afternoon, read simply, "We thought we were warriors. We were just arithmetic, numbers on the wrong side of an equation we couldn't solve." After the war, interrogators asked Luftwaffe pilots what had surprised them most about fighting the Americans. The answers were remarkably consistent. Not American fighter tactics, which were often predictable. Not American pilot skill, which was rarely exceptional. Not even American bravery, though many German pilots acknowledged that bomber crews showed remarkable courage in continuing missions despite horrific losses. What surprised them was the abundance. The endless, crushing, inexorable abundance. One pilot described watching a damaged B-17 jettison its bomb load over the North Sea rather than risk bringing live ordnance back to England. "They threw away more bombs in that moment than our entire squadron would receive in a month," he said. "And they did it as a safety precaution, as if bombs were too common to worry about. That was when I understood we couldn't win." Another pilot recalled being captured after bailing out over France and taken to an American POW collection point. "They gave us food immediately, White bread, canned meat, coffee. Real coffee, not ersatz. I asked the guard if this was special treatment for prisoners trying to get intelligence. He looked confused. He said, "This is just what we eat." Their ordinary rations were better than what our frontline troops received. Their prisoners ate better than our soldiers. A third pilot, Gunther Rahl, who survived the war with 275 victories, perhaps captured it best. We were fighting 20th century warfare with 19th century economics. The Americans were fighting with 21st century economics. We thought the war would be decided by who had the best pilots and the best aircraft. The Americans understood it would be decided by who had the most factories. They were correct. The B-17 Flying Fortress, that aluminum symbol of American industrial might, continued rolling off assembly lines until May 1945. The final production run was completed at Boeing's Seattle facility on April 29th, the day before Hitler committed suicide. By war's end, American factories had produced 12,731 B-17s. When B-24 production is included, the total exceeds 30,000 heavy bombers, more than the entire Luftwaffe aircraft production from 1939 to 1945. Each bomber represented approximately 40,000 man-hours of labor, 15,000 pounds of aluminum, 1,200 pounds of copper, and countless other materials extracted from American mines, refined in American smelters, shaped in American factories, and assembled by American workers. The bombers were instruments of war, but they were also monuments to industrial democracy, proof that free labor, working for wages in competitive markets, could outproduce slave labor and command economies. The irony would have been visible to any observer not blinded by ideology. The totalitarian states that claimed total mobilization and absolute efficiency were defeated by democracies that maintained competing corporations, labor unions, and market economies throughout the war. The chaos that fascists despised as weakness proved to be strength. The individualism they mocked as selfishness created voluntary cooperation more effective than their forced collectivism. The materialism they condemned as decadent produced the material superiority that crushed their armies. But perhaps the deepest irony was this. The German pilots who survived the war almost universally came to respect their American opponents, not for any particular tactical brilliance or individual heroism, but for embodying a truth that shattered fascist mythology. The Americans had proven that democracy, properly mobilized, was the most powerful form of national organization, yet devised by. Americans had proven that democracy, properly mobilized, was the most powerful form of national organization, yet devised by. State was to serve citizens rather than citizens serving the state unto death, mankind. Not because it produced superior individuals, but because it harnessed the collective efforts of ordinary people with an efficiency that no dictatorship could match. The assembly line, that symbol of capitalist alienation, had become the arsenal of democracy. The bomber production numbers that seemed like propaganda in 1943 were revealed as conservative estimates. The impossible had become routine. One bomber every hour, every day, for years on end, until the skies over Germany grew dark with them, and the Luftwaffe's finest pilots could do nothing but watch and die and understand, finally, that they'd been on the wrong side of history from the beginning. Epilogue: the bailout kit, that small pouch of emergency supplies that represented American abundance in miniature, became a curious relic of war. Thousands of them were scattered across Europe, dropped by parachute alongside doomed crews, buried in wreckage, or captured by German troops who divided their contents like treasure. After the war, a German veteran named Heinrich Böhrl, the logistics officer who'd examined one in 1943, became a writer. In his novel The Train Was on Time, published in 1949, He included a scene where a German soldier examines a captured American bailout kit and experiences an epiphany. This was not a weapon, Burrell wrote. It was a promise. Each item said, "We value you enough to give you the best chance of survival. We can afford to equip every airman with tools for living, not just dying. We believe you might come home." Burrell contrasted this with German military philosophy, which emphasized sacrifice unto death. German soldiers were given tools for killing efficiently. Their survival was secondary. The ideological message was clear. Individual lives mattered less than collective will. But the American bailout kit embodied a different philosophy. Every soldier was valuable, worth investing in, expected to survive and return home. It was democracy's answer to fascism, the belief that individual human life had inherent worth, that the purpose of the bombers themselves, those B-17s and B-24s that German pilots had faced in such despairing numbers, were mostly scrapped after the war. American industrial capacity, having produced them in tens of thousands, discarded them just as readily. Some were converted to civilian transports. Others were stripped for aluminum and melted down. Many were simply abandoned in foreign fields, left to rust and decay because America could afford to waste them. The casual disposal of such expensive, sophisticated machines, each one representing technology Germany had struggled to match, was perhaps the final insult to German pretensions of efficiency. But a few were preserved. Museums acquired them as monuments to industrial achievement. They sit now in climate-controlled hangars, their aluminum skins polished, their gun turrets empty, their bomb bays silent. Visitors walk through them, touching the rivets, sitting in the crew positions, marveling at the cramped quarters where young men face death at 25,000 feet. The museum placards mention combat records and mission counts and Medal of Honor recipients. They rarely mention the most important fact. These aircraft were not exceptional. They were ordinary. They were the standard product of an industrial system that treated their creation as routine. They were democracy's weapons built by democracy's methods, embodying democracy's strengths and contradictions. They were imperfect, often uncomfortable, sometimes mechanically troublesome. But they came in such numbers that their imperfections didn't matter, because there were always more. One bomber every hour. The rhythm of American industrial power, the drumbeat of democracy's arsenal, the sound of fascism's doom being manufactured on an assembly line in Michigan while the Reich's finest warriors flew and died, and understood, too late, that they'd been fighting mathematics they could never overcome. The skies are quieter now, but the lesson remains, inscribed in riveted aluminum and recorded in production statistics. There is a kind of power that flows from free people working in voluntary cooperation, and that power, properly organized, can build victory 1 hour at a time until tyranny drowns beneath its weight. The factories are silent now, but their legacy flies on in the freedoms they forged. One bomber, 1 hour, one inexorable step toward liberation at a time.